I've told you about Brands's first law of history. There are no laws of history. I believe I've shared with you Brands's fourth law of history. Sooner or later, countries get the foreign policies they can afford. Now it's time for Brands's second law of history, which is, very simply, it's complicated. Brands's second law of history says it's complicated. How complicated? More complicated than you think. What if I think it's really complicated? More complicated than that. If there is a fundamental principle of history, at least that I've inferred from my study of history over the years, is things are always more complicated than they seem. I'm going to demonstrate, or give you an illustration of Brands's second law in the context of American relations with American policy toward Vietnam, in the long period that starts around 1950 and ends in the mid-1970s. So this is, at least this lecture, is about the background to America's Vietnam War. So our story begins with, well, in some ways, it begins with the American Revolution. The American Revolution. What was the American Revolution? It was a struggle on the part of a bunch of colonials, a bunch of colonists, a bunch of people living in the American colonies for independence from their imperial, their colonial overlord, Britain. So the term wasn't in use at the time in the 1770s and 1780s, but by the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s, it would be in very common use. What the American Revolution was a nationalist revolt, a nationalist rebellion against a colonial imperial power. And this is exactly what was going on in Vietnam. Vietnam was a part of French Indochina. Indochina, it was that area between India and China in Southeast Asia. French Indochina from the late 19th century, when France established colonial control over the region, which included three countries: Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So the three together were called French Indochina, and the French governed Indochina as this one colonial entity, of which Vietnam was a part. And Vietnam, or more precisely, some Vietnamese in the early part of the 20th century said, this is not what we want. We don't want to be colonists in a French empire. We want to have an independent country of our own. This is the definition, or at least by the 20th century, this is the definition of nationalism. People want a country of their own. And they were led by a man who took the nom de guerre, the war name, Ho Chi Minh. And Ho Chi Minh would be the foremost of the Vietnamese nationalists, fighting against outside control of Vietnam, fighting to see that Vietnam would have a government, a country of its own. Ho Chi Minh at first took on the French. The French were the colonial rulers of Vietnam, so Ho Chi Minh became anti-French, and he waged a political and eventually military struggle against the French rulers. This is very much what happened in Cuba in the 1890s that drew the United States into a war against Spain. And this is important because in the 1890s, the United States sided with the nationalists against the colonial rulers. And this was natural, given the fact that Americans themselves were nationalists fighting against colonial rulers at the birth of America. So what we're seeing really is the struggles of people to create their own states. This is the birth of modern states. And the United States arguably was the original model of this. The United States supported nationalist revolts against colonial control in the early and mid-1800s in Latin America. So when when what was New Spain, when revolutionary movements developed in Mexico and developed in Argentina and developed elsewhere in South and Central America, the United States gave moral support, didn't give military support, eventually gave diplomatic support, but definitely Americans were rooting for the nationalists. The same was true when various parts of the Ottoman Empire in Europe began to rise up in revolt, when Greek nationalists revolted against Ottoman control, with Greece with the Greeks wanting a country of their own. And then down through the 1890s with the United States supporting the nationalists in Cuba against the Spanish. There was a little bit of a complication once the United States itself became a colonial power in the Philippines. And the United States fought to suppress a nationalist revolt in the Philippines. But most Americans saw that as an exception. And in fact, it was the very fact that Americans were fighting to suppress a nationalist revolt in the Philippines that caused Americans to turn away from an imperial future for the United States. It just did not sit well with Americans. Americans reflexively supported the nationalists against the colonialists. And so, during the 1920s, 1930s, Americans gravitated in the direction of supporting Ho Chi Minh in the Vietnamese nationalist revolt he led against France. Except that Vietnam was very far away, and it was an isolationist era, the 1920s and 1930s, for the United States. And so most Americans, to the extent that they knew about it, they said, you go good, Ho, but we're not going to make a big deal of it. So anyway, this was the situation until the outbreak of World War II, or the War in the Pacific, when Japan invaded Indochina. The Japanese displaced the French, drove the French out of Indochina, including Vietnam. And so now, Ho Chi Minh, for a moment, Ho Chi Minh thought, okay, well, good, the French are gone, and the Japanese coming in, well, they're sort of fellow Asians, and maybe they will look more favorably upon Vietnamese independence. In fact, that was not the case, and Japanese rule in Vietnam became harsh and oppressive. So what does Ho Chi Minh do? He re-raises the flag of revolt, this time against Japan. So now it is a Vietnamese nationalist revolt against Japan. And this is one that the United States can support wholeheartedly, not just sympathetically on the part of the American people, but with aid from the American government because, of course, the United States during World War II is fighting against Japan. And so if Ho Chi Minh is fighting against Japan as well, then Ho Chi Minh is an ally of the United States. And so the United States sent aid and advisors and whatever help it could to Vietnam, to Ho Chi Minh. And Vietnam was not a central theater of the war in the Pacific for the United States. Of course, it was for the Vietnamese, but nonetheless, Ho Chi Minh was seen as one of the good guys. He was on the good side. Now, here's where things get a little complicated, but as you'll see, not too complicated. Ho Chi Minh was a Vietnamese nationalist. He was also a committed communist. Ho Chi Minh firmly believed in the principles of communism. He looked at the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, the one in the 1910s, that led the Communist Party, then called the Bolshevik Party, to power in Russia. And he saw that this was the force, this was the ideology that would lead to Vietnamese independence. And so Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist. In American thinking, that's good. But he was also a communist. And in most American thinking, most of the time, that was bad. And so Americans kind of had to balance the good nationalist Ho with the bad communist Ho. During World War II, this was not an insuperable problem. The United States had a formal alliance with the communists of the Soviet Union. The United States was allying with China and using Chinese communists against Japan. So the United States is willing to support Ho Chi Minh against Japan. In the time of war, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So this was the situation. And Ho found himself working with Americans, and they seemed to get along okay. And then comes the end of the war in the Pacific with the Japanese surrender, at which point Ho Chi Minh is thinking, okay, finally success. He had been fighting against the French and then the Japanese for a quarter of a century by this time. The French were gone. He can't say that he drove out the French because the French were driven out by the Japanese, but nonetheless, you take your victories where you can get them. And so with the surrender of Japan, Ho was thinking, okay, now is the time. Vietnam is going to become independent. And in fact, he was so optimistic about Vietnamese independence and and this also demonstrates the fact that the United States and Ho Chi Minh were working in collaboration, that Ho asked an officer of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, America's pre-CIA spy agency, if they somehow get him a copy of the American Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson's statement of American independence and why, and the rights that it was established to preserve. Because Ho Chi Minh deeply admired the American model of anti-colonial revolution had inspired him, and the words of the Declaration of Independence had inspired him as well. And he was going to borrow it for a Vietnamese Declaration of Independence. He hadn't been able to pull this off plausibly until now, but it looked like he was going to. And so, in 1945, 1946, it looks as though Vietnam is finally going to get its independence. Ho Chi Minh is going to accomplish his life's work. But then the French come back. Now, the French decided to come back to Indochina in part because, well, they had been driven out by the Japanese. The Japanese are gone, so they're just going to come back and reclaim what they had claimed before. There was a little bit extra going on for the French because World War II was pretty humiliating for France. In contrast to World War I, where French soldiers had stood up to the Germans and the trench warfare that took place mostly in France had gone on for years, and it was this bitter struggle, and the French really held their own. In World War II, the French just rolled over. And when the Germans attacked in the spring of 1940, France surrendered and was occupied within 6 weeks. So the French had kind of an inferiority complex coming out of World War II. And to reclaim French prestige, they thought they needed to reclaim the French Empire. So they send troops that are demobilized from France after the war in Europe is over, and they send them back to Indochina, and they reoccupy Indochina, including Vietnam. And Ho Chi Minh sees them coming and says, oh my gosh, I've got to start all over again. And Americans have to figure out what to do about this, because the United States felt responsible for, well, not to put it too finely, for the world in a way after World War II they'd never felt before. American leadership first, but the American people had signed on to what I've called sort of the Wilsonian project, the Wilsonian vision, that the United States needs to remain involved in world affairs. Otherwise, there will be another war, more costly than World War I and World War II. So after World War II, actually starting during World War II, but concluding after World War II, American leaders paid attention to almost everything that was going on in the world. And they had a double reason for paying attention to what was going on in Indochina, in Vietnam. Number one, the United States was very concerned about getting France back on its feet, because France was going to be an ally of the United States in the Cold War against the Soviet Union and communism. The United States, this was still a little bit before the creation of NATO, but France was going to be a central member of NATO. And the United States was forming this alliance to contain, using the Truman administration's term, to contain Soviet expansion. So the United States needs to cozy up to France. It needs French support. And it needs to demonstrate that sort of France is this going concern, because there was a worry in American circles, on the part of American leadership, that the Communist Party, there was a French Communist Party. And if the French Communist Party was voted into power in France, that would be a terrible thing, because they would be communists, presumably allied with the Soviet Union. But if they took power by elected means, by democratic means, well, the United States had really no basis for complaint against them. So, anyway, they need to help the French government, the existing French government, the anti-French government, show some success. So the United States is sending, well, by 1947, 1948, 1949, is sending aid to France, eventually under the Marshall Plan. So the United States is bankrolling France. And the French government is using some of this aid that was supposed to reconstruct France to rebuild the French Empire. And the United States sort of looked the other way. This is France's business, and we're not going to get in the way, because we need to help France. That was sort of one part of the complication of this. And then on the other side of this, the United States is falling out with the Soviet Union. The Cold War is coming on. And the United States is becoming more and more opposed to communism, not just to the Soviet Union, but to communism. As I mentioned in an earlier lecture, the Cold War was this dual struggle. It was a struggle of great powers. There was a geopolitical struggle, the potential struggle of army against army. That's what the arms race was all about. But it was also this philosophical, ideological struggle. Democracy against communism, capitalism against socialism. So it's who's going to win this struggle. So even if Ho Chi Minh had not been allied with the Soviet Union, he wasn't yet, he was a communist. And it was generally thought, it was seen, that a communist victory anywhere was a victory for communism everywhere. So the United States has reasons to want to help France, or more precisely the French government, and it also has reason to oppose the Soviet Union in the expansion of communism. So there are these forces that are moving the United States to help the French against Ho Chi Minh. And I have to stress, I have to underline how much against the American character and much against American history this went. Because as I said earlier, the United Americans had been reflexively pro-nationalist, anti-colonialist since the birth of the United States. But now the United States is becoming pro-colonialist and anti-nationalist. And this because Ho Chi Minh is both a nationalist, that's good, but also a communist, that's bad. And American leaders have to decide, is the good side of Ho Chi Minh more powerful than the bad side, more powerful on the plus side than the bad side of Ho Chi Minh, the communist side, is on the negative side? Well, in the spring and early summer of 1950, when Harry Truman, president, is under bitter attack by Joseph McCarthy for being soft on communism. This was the charge McCarthy leveled against Truman all the time. And at the moment that the Communist Army of North Korea invaded anti-communist South Korea, Harry Truman made a fateful decision. This is sort of the first American step into what would become the Vietnam quagmire. I have to point out that we know in hindsight that it was a quagmire, but people didn't think it was a quagmire there. It was, okay, this is a decision you make. And the decision was the United States would send aid to Vietnam, that is more precisely to the French in Vietnam directly. It didn't have to be laundered through Paris. So if France needs weapons, if France needs money in Vietnam, it's going to get it directly. And this because at the moment of the outbreak of the war in Korea, the Truman administration had to fear that there was going to be this general communist offensive in Asia. So to prevent anything like that from happening, the United States starts sending aid directly to the French anti-nationalists in Vietnam. So the United States now has this, in effect, a presence in Vietnam, and it's a presence against Ho Chi Minh and the nationalists. But that's not the way Harry Truman phrased it. It was a presence against Ho Chi Minh and the communists because of this dual characteristic, these twin values that Ho Chi Minh espoused. So this was the situation in the early 1950s, actually from 1950 to 1954. The United States is aiding the French colonialists in Vietnam against Ho Chi Minh and the nationalists / communists. The French are not able to pull it off. They fight Ho Chi Minh, but Ho Chi Minh is better at this struggle. He's certainly more popular. If you're a nationalist leader, you tend to get the population on your side against these foreigners. And a lot of Vietnamese were quite happy or quite driven to get rid of the foreigners. They'd gotten rid of the French once, they got rid of the Japanese, now the French back, let's get rid of them. And so Ho Chi Minh and his group, the Vietnamese, they're called the Viet Minh, these are the Vietnamese communists, they fight the French to a standstill until a climactic battle at Dien Bien Phu in the northern part of Vietnam, where a French garrison is surrounded. And the French government comes to the United States. Dwight Eisenhower is now president. And they say, can you help us out? Can you bail us out of this fix we've gotten ourselves into? And Eisenhower says no. Eisenhower was a shrewd judge of what military power could accomplish. And he thought the French were losers in this. Eisenhower didn't have a whole lot of respect for French military expertise and power as a consequence of World War II. And he wasn't going to go to the aid of the French in Indochina. So he said, forget it. You're not going to get it. So the French decide to pull up stakes and leave. There is a peace conference that's held in Geneva. And as a result of the peace conference, the French agree we're out of Vietnam. And Vietnam will be divided between a communist north and a non-communist south. The communists under Ho Chi Minh, they had military control over most of the north, but they didn't really claim much in the south. So it was sort of a ceasefire in this struggle, the way Ho Chi Minh saw it, a struggle for all of the future of Vietnam. But it divided Vietnam, well, temporarily, it was thought. In fact, the plan was there's going to be elections. There will be elections to elect a government for all of Vietnam, a government for independent Vietnam. And so this happens in 1954. That's when the agreement is struck. And the elections are supposed to take place within a couple of years, so by 1956. But by 1956, Eisenhower, he's modified his thinking somewhat. He was okay with seeing the French get out of there because he thought the French would never control things. But Eisenhower himself came under attack for potentially being soft on communism. Now, it was a tough charge to make stick against Eisenhower because it was the Republicans who mostly said this, and Eisenhower was a Republican. But there were those who really thought that the United States should be really careful not to let any more territory go communist. And Eisenhower says very quietly, we're not going to let the elections happen. Because Eisenhower knew that if the elections did happen, Ho Chi Minh and his communists would be the big winners. And in his memoirs, Eisenhower said if the elections were held, Ho's party would have gotten 85% of the votes. So he subverts, Eisenhower subverts the agreement by which the United States was supposed to help see the creation of this united Vietnam, this united independent Vietnam. Now, Vietnam, which was divided temporarily, then becomes divided, it's ever more permanently. It wasn't supposed to be this way. There was, as I say, supposed to be this set of elections, and Vietnam would have this unified government. But at this point of the Cold War, the fact of a country being divided was hardly unique. Germany was still divided. Germany was kind of the original country that was supposed to be united after elections, and then have a new post-World War II government. But Germany was still divided between the communist part, East Germany, and the non-communist, the Western part, West Germany. Same thing in Korea. Korea had been divided in 1945, and it was just supposed to be a temporary division, but that division had grown permanent, and it seemed more permanent than ever after the Korean War. So the fact that Vietnam was divided and might be divided forever, this was no longer a surprising sort of thing that had to be explained away. So what happened in the absence of these elections was the emergence of a permanent communist regime in the northern part of Vietnam, which came to be called North Vietnam, and an anti-communist regime in the southern part of Vietnam, which came to be called South Vietnam. And each had its formal name, and I should point out that each of the names implied that the government in the north was supposed to be the government over all of Vietnam, and likewise for the government in the south. The government in the south was the Republic of Vietnam. It didn't say South Vietnam. But everybody knew that the northern folks only governed in the north and the southern folks only governed in the south. And the United States treated the government of South Vietnam under a president named Ngo Dinh Diem as an ally of the United States in the global struggle against communism. And so the United States sent more and more aid directly to this Vietnamese protege, this protege state. So the United States, to retrace a little bit, the United States had aided Ho against the Japanese in World War II. Then the United States had switched sides and aided the French against Ho and the Vietnamese nationalists post-World War II until 1954 when the French pull out. Now Eisenhower has to decide, okay, does the United States, do I as president, just say, okay, we've done what we can do for Vietnam and we're going to get out of there? There was a temptation to do that, but there was also a recognition if the United States did that in the mid-1950s, Ho's side would win. It was more popular, it was better organized militarily. So Eisenhower says no. Eisenhower does not want to see South Vietnam go communist. And this was partly out of concern for the people who lived in South Vietnam, very many of whom did not want to have a communist government. So part of this was out of sincere concern for the Vietnamese, because Eisenhower believed, and a lot of people believed, including many of the people in South Vietnam, that a communist government would be a brutal dictatorship, which is in fact what it became and what it was in North Vietnam. They say, we don't want any of this. So American leaders, the American people, could support the anti-communist regime in South Vietnam with a clear conscience. But it also served America's own global policy of containment. So this was the situation. But the trouble with the government in South Vietnam was that it never was particularly popular. And President Diem, in fact, found himself more and more unpopular, partly because they just ruled in a very bad way. There was a corrupt government, and the members of the government, the officials, were out of touch with the people. Also because Ho Chi Minh's promise of nationalism, of getting rid of the foreigners, resonated against the government of South Vietnam, which was clearly propped up by the United States. So the French had been the original colonial oppressors, then Japan had been the next set of oppressors, then the French came back, and now it was the United States. So Ho Chi Minh, during this phase of the struggle against South Vietnam and the United States, could take the position that we're the nationalists. Ho Chi Minh could emphasize the nationalism in his project and de-emphasize the communism. And if some people in South Vietnam didn't like communism, play soft on that and really put forward nationalism. We're going to drive those foreigners out. It's Vietnam for the Vietnamese. And this is the way he portrayed himself. And Diem, the South Vietnamese leader, couldn't very well make that argument because he was propped up with American support. So anyway, the Diem became more and more unpopular, and there was an uprising within South Vietnam itself against sort of a South Vietnamese nationalist movement against Diem and against his American sponsors. Well, this group, called the National Liberation Front, or colloquially Vietcong, they became de facto allies of Ho Chi Minh and the communists of North Vietnam. And so by the early 1960s, Diem is beset with pressure from North Vietnam and this internal uprising from within. And the new government of the new administration of John Kennedy says, oh boy, this guy is a loser. And he tries what he can. He sends combat troops for the first time to aid the army of South Vietnam, the army of Vietnam, South Vietnam, and they're still losing. And so Kennedy gives a quiet nod to a group in Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, who say we want to overthrow Diem and put in a regime that can really hold things together. And so Kennedy says, yeah, okay. He doesn't make it public, but he says, okay, that's going to be all right. And Diem is overthrown. Not only is he overthrown, he's murdered. And in the couple of weeks after this, Kennedy is hoping, all right, we're going to get a better, more efficient, maybe more popular government that can hold things together. But then Kennedy himself was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald in the United States. So as of the end of 1963, there's a new regime that's trying to take hold in Saigon in South Vietnam, and there is a new president in the United States, Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson has to make a new set of decisions. What am I going to do? What is the United States going to do in this particular moment? where the government in South Vietnam is in disarray, trying to hold itself together, and I'm trying to figure out what to do with my own administration in Washington. So we'll get to that in the next lecture.